The true grace of the awake field is in the silence. There's no content that really has any relevance. If the longing of the heart is for freedom, it is to recognize that freedom is always here in the silence of being. The awake field is ever awake, ever knowing itself, ever fresh, flowing within itself, fully vital and alive. And as soon as we attune to the resonance of the silent being, we are attuned with Source. Being attuned with Source, with the simple resonance of being, is to open to the vast infinite field, the timeless one that always is. Mm. There is no more information to gather. There is nothing to know, nothing to understand. You find yourself in what has been lost, not what has been gained or achieved. It is seeing through the delusion of loss and gain, good and bad, right and wrong, and to come to the silence of being that is before all of these play of opposites. The vast, open, awake field that in the knowing of itself is just so alive with the natural freedom of being. Mm. There is a softness here, there is a gentleness, a kindness here, because the natural being is pure, simple love, is compassion. In truth, there is never a need to question, is this the being? Because if the question arises, it is always the mind questioning and not the being. To be resting in the deep silent ground of being, it is absolutely obvious by the clarity and sense of freedom and openness. It is absolutely obvious because the being just is. There's nothing else but the being knowing itself. The simplicity is what gives it away, that it is utterly simple. Mm. We could even say that the simplicity is radical, a radical simplicity. The mind doesn't like radical. The mind likes comfort and to know. But the radical simplicity is freedom, is the openness. It is the simplicity of being yourself, just simply being here. It is just to come to the simple felt sense of presence, the sense of simple existence, the I am, and to know that the I am is shared with divine wholeness. Simple existence, simple presence is the one simple presence of what is. There is nothing complicated here. The simplicity of being is the being itself. It is simple to come to the being, just the presence that is here. It is who you are, and what you have always been. You have never been away from yourself. You have always been yourself. The part that is hard is facing yourself, facing the ego, facing all of the parts that want to believe something different and move within complexity and hang on to the acquired knowledge, experiences, and stories. And it is hard. It is hard to face yourself because the ego sense is so adept at avoiding itself. It has such an accomplished ability to avoid itself and to keep moving within the patterns of protection. So when it gets spoken that to come to freedom is the end of the ego, it is the end of protection, it is the end of conditioning. It is really, we could say, the ability to face yourself, to face the mind and all that it wants to bring forward without believing anything, without being stirred, and the ability to just rest in the simplicity of being. What makes it hard is not because coming to the being is hard. What makes it hard is the conditioned habit to believe the mind and to stay in the protective patterns. And that's why it takes a lot to come to the readiness for this opening to really root itself. It takes for the longing to be so deep that it is one-pointed and that nothing else is wanted more than this truth. Because if there is something that is wanted more than this truth, then that will carry you away from yourself. It also takes for there to be the ability to be present with all that life brings forward without wavering, being able to receive the grace of life without moving into the personal. And it takes a recognition that everything that is happening is for the whole and not for the me. Once these pieces start to come into place, that is really the sign that there is a readiness, that there is a getting closer. Of course, in truth, you are always the being. The being is always here. You are always free. But that can feel like, well, I can hear that, but it doesn't feel like that. And we always have to stay true to what is the direct experience, what is being lived. Because whatever is being lived holds a wisdom. And so if there is challenge arising, then it is to be able to face what feels challenging. And to face what feels challenging means to be able to feel the feelings and sensations that are stirred in the nervous system. Because essentially, consciousness is your nervous system. Consciousness knowing itself is the nervous system, alive and open and free and flowing. Now, if there is some kind of challenge and the nervous system is full of energy, it is the most kind to be with that energy and to allow that energy to settle with the support of loving presence. Now, you always are the presence, the loving presence. You are the presence of being. So you have this naturalness to be fully present with whatever is arising. And of course, if there is a charge in the nervous system, if there is some kind of protection or some kind of story playing, the nervous system is the sign of that. And it will bring the feeling of being the me, being separate and not resting in the being. And yet all the while, the being is right here, because the being is always right here. There can even be a sense of, well, there's a knowing of that. But in the moment where there is a trigger happening, it's really the mind remembering. Because when the knowing of the being is in place, you are just simply in the being. And when the being knows, the disturbance is not disturbing, right? There's nothing that is able to create a disturbance. And so if there is some kind of disturbance that arises, the kindest natural movement is to be fully present with what is arising, and to be fully present for as long as it takes, to not waver, and to be so vigilant not to believe the mind and move on the narrative, but to be so present with the sensations and aliveness of the nervous system. Because what the nervous system is revealing is that there is discordance in consciousness that is arising. And when discordance in consciousness arises, it is arising on a simple trajectory to release and free itself into pure consciousness. And so when we come to the pure consciousness, which is the pure sense of being, the presence, and just be present with whatever is stirring, then we allow whatever is stirring and being stirred to settle, be illuminated, be held in a loving presence, so that it may, in its own natural unraveling, release and soften. Everything that arises is here for freedom. Everything is here in support of freedom. Everything is here in support of freedom. Of course, the mind doesn't see it that way, because the mind wants things to be the way that the mind wants. The mind wants to be comfortable, and it doesn't want to have to face itself. And that is why this unfolding will never, ever be comfortable for the me and the mind. The moments of grace where there is a knowing of the being and a sense of freedom, of course, there is a comfort, because there is a relaxation and a sense of openness, and there's no disturbance. But of course, in the process of refinement, because of the habituated habit to go towards what the mind says and to engage in life through the mind and through the story and the me and the my wants and desires, because of that default program that takes its own sweet time to unfold, it is necessary to just keep coming to the being again and again and again, and meeting the feelings again and again and again. That it doesn't mean anything about where you are. The process of refinement, in fact, the maturing that happens during the process of refinement a marker is the noticing that you're not resisting the refinement, and you're not finding anything wrong with it, because the mind, of course, is disturbed by the process. The mind doesn't like it. The mind doesn't like feeling uncomfortable, and it has been conditioned to constantly move to what feels pleasant and pleasurable, and to constantly attempt to keep a pleasant feeling and a pleasant way of moving alive. But this process is going to undermine everything that is conditioned. It will undermine and pull out the rug from everything that is conditioned, and everything that the mind thinks it knows of as part of its strategy for protection. Everything is going to be challenged, because how can any of that stay in place and there be freedom, right? So when there's a speaking of the longing for freedom, we have to realize that what freedom is it's the end of the ego, the end of protection. It's the end of really the ego sense and the protection and the conditioning running the show. There is so much that gets spoken about having an awakening that the mind holds on to, and it holds on to the idea of awakening that it likes the idea of. But it's really not the way that the mind imagines. The mind can only conceptualize what any idea of awakening is within a limited context. And so it is never the way the mind imagines, but the mind is constantly trying to make what is happening align with its conceptual idea of what it thinks awakening is. What the mind doesn't really grasp is that awakening itself is a destructive process. It's a breaking down, it's an unraveling, it's an undoing, it's a dissolution. And the dissolution is of the protection and conditioning that the ego is made of, that in a way, the mind is made of. Of course, none of this actually exists in truth as a separate entity, but where the consciousness has identified at a point and is stuck, hooked in that belief, the flow of consciousness, the flow of life, the flow of wisdom, intelligence is going to, in right timing, in perfect timing for every being, when there is a readiness, it is going to move to undo, unhook, unravel, untangle, and dissolve the great misunderstanding. And so this process is never, ever going to be comfortable for the me and the ego that wants things to stay the same. And that's why there has to be an absolute, unquestionable impulse and pull for this truth. Because if that isn't in place, and it's no criticism if it's not in place, but if it's not in place, then it will feel really, really hard. And it will feel like, I don't even want this anyway. And so there has to be this pull. And of course, the pull is the magnetic force of the divine calling itself. And it is grace itself that there is even a pull in any degree within the being. It is grace indeed, and a sign of a maturity that there is even a pull. Because for so many that isn't even in place, right? And so it is grace to have the pull, to have the longing. And it is grace to come to a sense of following that. And we come to the sense of following that even before it's one-pointed. It's like, in a way, the longing or the pull itself matures through the human experience of a longing or a pull, and it matures to being very important, to being the most important, maybe, possibly, yes, right? It matures, and at some point, it truly becomes one-pointed. And when it is one-pointed, it's unquestionable, because there's a choicelessness and a recognition that there's a willingness to let anything and everything in life go, because the longing is so great. And, you know, we can test this longing, because we can say things like, well, are you willing to let all of your belongings go? Are you willing to let your relationship go? Are you willing to let all of your favorite things go? Are you willing to let, you know, your job go? We can play this testing, and within this, even where we feel like, no, it's the only thing, and then we start to feel something inside that says, oh, well, actually, that feels hard. And it's okay that that feels hard, because this is hard. It's hard. There's no question that it's hard. And it takes a lot. It takes everything. It takes everything to follow the longing and the pull. And it never means what the mind imagines that it means. But there are these places that are almost like edges. No one is watching you and marking your book. It's an internal process. It's you with yourself. It's you facing your own mind, you facing your own discordance, and you opening to your own glory. The whole unfolding is happening inside your own being, your own consciousness. And so any words that are spoken from consciousness to consciousness, from the self to itself. And how they are received, what they stir, what they bring forward, what they bring alive, that is the grace of the intelligence, bringing alive your internal process and inviting you to keep looking, keep being present with what is up, what is stirred, what's alive, what's happening in the internal process, what's happening in the reflection of the life, what feels beautiful and smooth, what feels hard, and to be open as the openness of being to all of it, because all of it is part of the unfolding. Now we can continue to point and say, you are the being that is free. You are the being that is free. You are the simplicity. And the more that this is recognized, it's a refuge. It's a refuge to rest and watch. It's the refuge to rest and watch the internal dynamics. It's a refuge to watch the dynamics that are at play on the surface of life. And the more there can be a resting and a watching, the more there can be a receiving of it all. And also a watching when things get sticky, when things get hooked. It's so easy for the interceptor to come in and say, well, you're failing. Because the mind imagines this kind of switch that's going to turn, and then all light and glory and freedom. And it doesn't really understand or want to know about the refinement process. And however much we speak about the refinement, the mind can't really understand it, because the mind isn't involved in it. and the mind is still gunning for the lotus pad and the light, right? The mind is still gunning for the awakening that's gonna just bring light beams and, you know, celestial trumpets, and that the whole surface of life play and game is just going to be over. And you know what the mind does is it fixates upon this book or this story that tells the story that it wants, right? And it will say, oh, but I've heard about this one, that this happened, and I've heard about this, and I've heard that it's, so it fixates, but it fixates upon what it wants without realizing that within consciousness, it's creating, in a way, a fixed point out of its desire and misunderstanding. It's not hanging on and fixating on what's true. It's fixating on a fantasy, right? It isn't helped by the fact that the way the surface of life plays at the moment is that not all beings that have awakenings are willing to reveal the struggles. That the stories can be the story of this happened and then this happened and there's freedom and it's shiny and glorious and la 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 la. And the mind says, yes, please. Yes, please to that. And yes, there's so much beauty, so much, and so many are tasting the beauty of opening and the taste of freedom, the taste of yourself, the tasting of the flow of bliss, feeling the lightness and the clarity. And of course, in the openness, it feels like this is forever. And it is. It is. The discovery is forever. It's eternal. You've always been that, and you will always be that. And as far as the play of the human experience goes, you're also in the process of casting off the residues of the shadowlands so that the dwelling, the residing in this glory can be lived and abided in forever. And yet there is this refinement that has to happen. And as the refinement happens, it's sticky and uncomfortable and hard for everyone, right? And everyone has to keep looking. In a way, the great problems that can arise are when there has been openings, awakenings that have been very wide and deep and clear and beautiful. And if there is a stopping looking and believing in perfection that the mind subtly gets hold of, then at some point that will be questioned and humbled, right? Nothing escapes the humbling of coming to know divine wholeness. Nothing, no one escapes. We could say that you don't ever escape the karmic obscurations. Everything that has to be lived through has to be lived through. Everything that is not purified and clear has to be humbled and purified. And that is why the refinement is actually such a divine and graced unfolding, and the maturing into the recognition that the sticky patches are too grace. The sticky patches are too divine. That it's about coming to an ability to stay open and free in the face of whatever arises, and to allow there to be a freedom of a free flow of whatever needs to flow, whether it's some kind of emotional releasing or tears or stress or anxiety. It's the allowing of it in the presence that doesn't judge it and doesn't make it wrong, that allows the refinement to actually happen so that there can be a clarifying and deepening of the recognition of what is true. So there's so much beauty to the unfolding, but the mind is still fixated upon its idea of perfection or awakeness, which is not true. It's in the realm of delusion. It's in the realm of limitation. And so it doesn't allow space for everything that is happening to be allowed to happen naturally. So we could say that really the great divine truth, that which is God, is really what is. So we can say everything is God. God is all, only one. And really what that brings us to is what is. Just this, just this, just this. Where there's no wavering, whatever it is. And that there's a constant refinement and a constant willingness to look. Because the constant willingness to look is the natural awareness, the natural silent awareness. It's natural to be aware. And the natural awareness is always willing to look, always willing to look. Even if it's looking confirms clarity, freedom, truth, this. There's a willingness to look and look and look. And if any kind of discordance comes in any way, a willingness to look, to stay still and look as awareness, right? So we have to really brush aside the myths because the myths around what awakening is are not really true. Divinity is purity, innocence. If we call it innocence, innocence is the playful, simple, untainted, right? It is the purity, it is the divinity, but the mind can have all different ideas about what divinity is, what God is. And really, as we open and we come to feel the flows of our own holiness, of the sacredness of everything, we start to feel what God is, that God is just this. And we let go of the concepts of what we have learned or imagined that God is. And we come to recognize that God is this. God is humility. God is no protection. God is just this. And every being can experience this when there is an aligning with the resonance of being. So the more we align, attune with the resonance, we open to the infinite, unbounded field. We open to the totality. We open to wholeness. It's not for the mind to measure, well, you're only this open, you're only that open. On a certain level, yes, according to the refinement of the consciousness, the frequency that we open to, it does get finer and finer and finer through refinement, right? But there's no point judging or measuring, because that which judges and measures doesn't understand the measurements, let's say. It doesn't understand the ways of measuring. It measures according to its limited misunderstanding of what awakening is. That's why there's such a simplicity. And there's also this very ordinary and natural ability to test everything in your direct experience. It's about coming to understand the nature of experience. And as we come to understand the nature of experience, we're moving from the belief in experience as what the mind is involved in the content of experience, to recognize that only direct experience is really relevant. And direct experience is the direct experience of yourself, of your being, of this moment of presence, right? So we can measure in the moment, but it's not a measuring that is like a surface of life measurement. The measure is open, free, clear, happy, joyful. Yes. Questioning, not sure, doubting. No, right? It's really simple. It's really, really simple. And as far as how far have you gone? How refined are you? How deep are you? How clear are you? It doesn't matter, because that which is asking those kind of questions doesn't really have the ability to understand. That is the one with a measuring stick, right? That's the one that doesn't have the ability to understand. As you rest in the being, the glorious thing about being in the openness is when you're in the openness, you feel a wholeness that feels like, this is it, this is it, this is it, right? You just feel. And then it's like suddenly, oh, this is it, this is it, this. But it's not even a sense of this is it. It's just, wow, openness, freedom, clarity, just beauty. There's no one measuring that. You're just so present and free and soft, and it doesn't matter. And there might be the ability to see, well, it seems like that one is experiencing, but then that's all the mind. So it's really all about this attunement and alignment as deep as the consciousness can go, because as soon as consciousness is resting in its purity as the being, you're in the one being. And no one is measuring, no one is, it's moving as one. You're completely aligned in service, on purpose, as in you're living your purpose. You're here now, you're free. And yes, there's refinement happening. Yes, there's all kinds of recalibrations and attunements and deepenings happening. But once you're resting in the felt sense of being, there's nothing that needs to think about any of that. It's just happening. And so too, you come to recognize in the knowing of the being that even what's happening on the surface of life is part of the flow of grace, right? So the deepening in the being allows there to be, in the flow of the knowing, a recognition of that everything that is flowing is the flow of life. It's a flow of grace. There's only one. This is a flow of surrender. And so whatever seems to be sticky, whenever there's a seeming getting hooked, it doesn't matter. You just allow the movement, the stickiness, to just move as it needs to move. Because in truth, however stuck you feel, love is holding you. Wholeness is holding you. The being that you are is holding you. Truth is still true. Light is still light, and love is still love. Whatever is happening in the mind, it never ever diminishes the wholeness that is always whole, and that you are always one with the wholeness that is always whole. And so everything that is ever happening is perfect. It's not perfect to the way the mind may want things to be, but it's a perfect whole functioning in whichever way it is functioning. And we have to say that the trajectory of consciousness is an evolutionary impulse to know itself in its purity, in its wholeness, and to go all the way into the divine remembering of its absolute, untainted innocence, its divinity, right? There can be so many ways of speaking of this. And of course, the resonance that comes is all that's important. The words are not important. Holding on to certain kind of ideas of teachings and different ways and paths, none of that is important. The only thing that is important is the resonance of being, because the innocent divinity is just a resonating light. It's a resonance. And it's coming to recognize that what we are in truth is a source resonance. We're a divine resonance. We're light resonating at a very fine frequency. And so we open through the denser frequencies, and we keep refining and refining as we lay down the burdens of the great misunderstanding, as we lay down the play of opposites, and we come to a sense of rebalancing, right? So the play of opposites is a play of imbalance, and let's say the world play of separation. It's imbalance. And it's almost as if every being has a job to find balance within your own functioning, within your internal functioning. And coming to balance is a rebalancing to come to a sense of being, which is like an equanimity, a harmony, or an equilibrium within your internal functioning. And the more that you rebalance your sense of personal, you open to a sense of, let's say, balance is the impersonal. Balance is pure consciousness. Balance is like a harmonious flow of pure consciousness. So in a way, we can open to taste that and to feel that. But where there are residues of imbalance, which are the protections and conditionings, we're going to be moved by the intelligence, by the flow of life, to fulfill our service, to rebalance our unique functioning, to bring our sense of personal and limitation and individual functioning into alignment and a remembering of functioning as one, right? And so a really huge part of this, as we spoke earlier, is when we come to recognize, oh, everything that's happening, it's all for the whole. Everything that's happening, all the sense of me and my life, everything that's refining, everything that's challenging, it's for the whole. So when we come to this sense that it's all for the whole, and there's no personal gain, there's no selfish gain in this unfolding, there's no personal awakening. This is a sign of a maturity, a sign of a readiness. That when we recognize this is all for the whole, and it's truly like a landing within us, right? Speaking it out loud, it's completely irrelevant and no one's listening. It's all about your internal functioning and the internal landing. Boom. Oh, this is all for the whole. There's something so profound happening here. And all of my functioning is for that, whatever it looks like, however sticky it feels to the me and the mind in the refinement process. This is all for the whole. This is all in service. Boom, I'm in. I'm not going to fight anymore, right? It's part of the maturing, right? So we spoke of, it's about the longing, the depth of the longing, and that the longing goes from, yeah, that sounds cool. Yeah, I'm in. Freedom, no suffering, I'm in. And the misunderstanding about awakening. Yeah, I want that. Yeah, I want that. Yeah, 100% in. I've got a party that weekend. I'm going to miss that sign. Oh, 100% in? Well, kind of, you know, it doesn't matter to anyone. It's all about your internal functioning. And that's why it doesn't matter if this one is sitting here all on my lonesome, or whether there's 300 people here. It does not matter, right? It's all the same. It's always the same. It's just this truth, just this truth, just this truth. And the focus here on this truth means that sometimes I get to play this with all of you. Beautiful. But it doesn't matter where you are, what you think, what's happening in your life. It doesn't matter to me in any way that you might imagine. It doesn't matter because it's only one. And it's one truth, one being, one wholeness. And the knowing here is that you are that. You are love, you are whole, you are perfect, you are beautiful, you are my own self. So it's never about trying to prove it to me or anyone else. It's about your own internal functioning and you coming to a place of being able to root and land. So when we speak about the one-pointed focus, at some point we move from this kind of wavering, this feeling, and you know, when the longing is strong and we're open, it's like all the way in, all the way in. And then something happens. Oh, well, actually, that's really important to me. It doesn't matter. Of course, your relationships are important. Of course, these things are important. And of course, you're going to be pushed and tested and challenged. But I'm not doing that. I'm not interested in that. You are interested in that. You are living through that, right? I know what that's like because that's happened here, right? And it's part of the unfolding that we're being humbled, we're being pushed, we're being challenged. And it's unique at every point, according to the consciousness and according to the wisdom. The flow of the intelligence of life is pushing all of the buttons. It's challenging, it's testing, and it's honing us to bring us to a one-pointed, choiceless, yes, yes, only this. And of course, it's grace. And as we speak of, the pull is the divine pulling you, pulling the one that feels to be separate and divided from the divine into the remembering of the divine. You already are the divine, and the divine knows that. And yet, when the consciousness is ready, there's a flow, like a magnetic force that starts to pull. And it's that that brings us to learn to meditate, start spiritual practices, start reading and exploring. It brings the sense of the seeker. It's all a flow of intelligence. We can't do anything different. This is never a doing. It's never a doing. And the speaking is only ever to enliven the natural pull inside. The speaking is only ever to fan the flame that is already alive and awake inside you, to bring a sense of recognition of what you already are, right? But no one is marking you. No one is measuring you. Your mind might be measuring you, but there's nothing else that's measuring, because that which knows knows there is only one, and it's all moving. All of this, whatever it looks like, is moving as one. And it moves the compass from a feeling of the longing that grows and grows and gets deeper and deeper and more one-pointed, until it feels like it's very important, the most important, most of the time, until that one-pointedness comes. And it doesn't mean that when the one-pointedness comes that you'll have lost everything and you're just sitting all in your lonesome on the sofa. It means that just an internal alignment with the pull, the magnetic pull inside you, that you've stopped resisting it and you started to really align with it and say, okay, yes, yes, yes. And so there's no external measure of that. It's an internal recognition of the choiceless nature of what is calling you from inside. And the coming to one-pointedness is, yes, it's a maturing. And of course, the mind loves like, oh, I want to be mature, but it's not that kind of maturing, right? It's a maturing, a ripening that naturally happens in consciousness according to the flow of consciousness, the readiness. It's just like you can't make a fruit ripen, right? You can try and set up all of these circumstances, but a true ripening is just a fruit growing on the tree or the vine in the warmth and the sunshine, with enough nourishment and rain, right? Enough showers, enough of everything that nourishes. And that's what ripens the fruit. What ripens the fruit is a little bit of everything that's good for it, right? It's not just all of the things that the mind might imagine. It's about the showers, the rain, all of it, right, is what nurtures. And so within our unfolding and our refinement, it's about the stormy times. It's about all that actually nourishes and brings more of a fertile ground to meet everything and refine everything, so that the one-pointedness comes to a refined point, right? So this is all naturally happening. It's naturally happening. And the being is so kind and patient, because the being knows that there is no forcing the river, there's no forcing the fruit to ripen, that at some point the fruit is going to ripen, and it's going to be sweet, and so sweet in its natural ripening, right? The sweetest fruit is the naturally ripened. And the sweet fruit, you don't pick it off with a tug, right? It's just, it almost just falls in. It's like the low-hanging fruit that is rich and ripe and sweet. And that is what is naturally happening in the process of refinement, right? No one's judging the fruit. No one's forcing the fruit. There's a natural sweetening, a natural purifying, a natural letting go right? Letting go of the blossom that the fruit is born out of, right? It's all a natural unfolding. And so the natural unfolding is grace. It's the flow of grace. And we come to recognize the flow of grace in the felt sense of being, in this attunement to the finest possible frequency, resonance that we have opened to, that we attune to the sanctuary, the silent sanctuary of being, where there's a sense of freedom and openness and clarity, right? We come to the stillness, to the silence, to the simplicity of just this moment, just like this, just this moment, just like this. And here you recognize the presence of being, your presence, the I am presence. And that presence is the presence of divine wholeness. We could say the presence is the presence of God. We can't understand this with the mind, but this is what's true of presence. So we come to this presence, and there's an openness, a spaciousness, a relaxation, and an ability to sense yourself wider, vaster, and open and natural, like a relaxation, just like a letting go, a deep exhale, and a letting go of whatever's playing on the surface, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the being. It's all happening, but the more we can just open to allow what's happening to be happening, not resisting it, not wanting it to be different, and recognize, oh, it's all just the flow of grace. Just be in the refuge of the sanctuary of being, in the stillness, in the silence, in the letting go, and just resting here. Watching as the awareness, watching the mind, watching the thoughts that come and go, watching anything that's moving and changing, and just dropping back and in, so that you're aware of everything and recognizing that what you're aware of is not who you are, that somehow who you are as the awareness, as the witnessing presence, is not touched by anything that you're aware of. You're watching and you're still, and you're watching what's moving and changing, and you're still, and you're watching and you're still. And you start to be more attuned to the stillness that is watching than the identification of attention with the moving, changing. You're just watching and you're still. And it's like you're zooming out and zooming out, and you're watching. You're watching the thoughts. You're watching the person. You're watching the whole story, the whole narrative. You're watching all of the characters in the story, and you're zooming out, and you're watching the whole environment, and you're zooming out, and you're watching the whole world, and you're zooming out, and you're watching the universe, and you're zooming out, and you're watching all that is, and you're zooming out, and you're still here, and you're just being, and you're just like this, and you're not any of it. You're not a thing. You're just the vast open spaciousness. And it's as if the zooming out zooms out until there's a recognition. There's nowhere else to zoom out. There's a stop and just a deep, still silence of just being. An ability to watch it all and to realize that you're independent and not touched by any of it, that you're utterly free. And a deeper resting comes. And as the being here, there's a peace and an openness. And here we find the balance, the equilibrium, the equanimity of being. Just simply being the peace that is wide open, pure awareness, that which is observing and watching it all, and yet not touched by any of it. And just resting here, resting in the silent sanctuary. And here there's a confirming that comes in the innermost being, where the being itself, just resting as the being, in the intimacy of just this, it recognizes in the beingness itself, just being. And it's the difference from the knowledge of the mind that thinks it knows something to the knowing of the heart. The heart knows. The heart is the being. It's the sense of just this being. And here, there's no question. There's no questioning, is this it? Because if there's a question, here's the grace of being able to test it. If the question comes, well, is this it? Be aware of the questioner. Who's asking? That one is not it. The questioner is not it. You're the awareness of the questioner. Stop. Anything that you're aware of, stop. And recognize that the awareness itself, the aware being itself, is not moving, is not changing. That there's a simplicity, an openness, and a natural sense of a relaxation, a natural sense of just being yourself. And it doesn't matter if thoughts are coming and going. It doesn't matter what is happening. It's not trying to change the moment. It's not trying to even stop the mind. Because at some point, the mind consciousness itself, within this flow of intelligence, the mind consciousness, which is a denser frequency, it just softens into a finer frequency. It refines into a finer frequency. It slows down. And just the resting. Now, mind consciousness can fire up again in any moment. And that's okay. It's not a problem. Just watch it. See it. If you don't identify with, and if the attention doesn't go towards it in believing or engaging, then just the ability to watch it will meet it with presence. And the meeting it with presence, it will naturally just let go. So there's nothing to do, nothing to understand. There's no practice, really, even though it might seem that way to the mind. The only practice is to come to be here and let go of doing, just be. And now let the intelligence move, let the intelligence flow. There's a kindness here. There is a patience here, a love and a compassion here, which is the naturalness of being. And here the intelligence flows to bring forward anything and everything that is needed in order to illuminate. Now, in truth, if we could just rest here and truly just watch and see the resistances, see everything, it would just illuminate and relax everything. But what happens is that something comes up that creates resistance or a pull to engage. And so we do identify. And it's as if then something has to play itself out on the surface. If we can just rest and watch, it doesn't have to play itself out. But very often it will play itself out because it's not easy to just rest. As we refine and refine, it becomes easier to just rest and watch. But the natural process is that we'll keep identifying and playing stuff out on the surface of life until those residues wind down. And those residues winding down are our assignment to take care of what seems to be personal until it doesn't seem personal anymore. And we open to the recognition of the impersonal. And here you see a natural refinement is happening. Natural recognition and natural clarity is happening. And natural deepening is happening. And all the while, you are so beautiful, and you are love, and you are one with divine wholeness. You never, ever leave the wholeness and love and beauty that you are in truth. The mind might have its own meanderings and unkindness, but in truth, none of that is here. And so that is why to catch the interceptors and recognize the only battle is with your mind, right? And this is where we come to speak of that what this awakening is, if we want to dare use such a word, because in truth, we really come to a point where we realize, oh, there is no awakening, there is no enlightenment, because it's just this. This has always been the way that it is. But as long as we have an idea of some kind of awakening, we have to really clarify what it really is so that we can, at least in the laws of nature, dispel some of the myths. And we have to let go of the myth that there is not anything hard in this, or that something miraculous is going to happen and everything's going to disappear and suddenly be easy. We want to let go of that myth because this unfolding is hard, right? This is the truth, is that it's hard and it takes everything. And that's why the natural refinement brings us to a one-pointedness where we have what it takes, and it brings in everything that we need in order to remain, stay the course, let's say. We have it within us. We have everything that is required within us because it's an internal unfolding into our own divinity, our own innocence, our own purity. Now, on the level of the me and the mind, there's this curious craziness that we're actually afraid in a way of our own innocence, our own purity, our own divinity. That we're bound within these ideas of not being worthy of that. And of course, none of it's true. So there are ways that we would rather stay in the great misunderstanding than face what it takes to face. Now, what do we have to face? It's like a confrontation with your own ego again and again and again, because we cannot come to this freedom by denying anything. We have to face the ego sense again and again and again, and we have to be humbled again and again and again. And this will keep happening however deep and find the frequency we are resonating at and opening to. If there are residues, we will be carried through what is needed to be humbled and to remember the humility to remember that the human experience is hard, and to remember that there's a fragility to our humanness within the body. There's a fragility to a vulnerability to our human experience that remains, right? It remains within, let's say, the shell of what our human experience plays out like on the surface. We can deepen and deepen within our internal knowing into what we are, but there are certain aspects that are still always going to remain in the human experience as long as we have a body. And let's say our direct experience of that can shift and change to not being a struggle, not be feeling like suffering, not feeling hard or hard, but as the awareness, the innate awareness, we have to have this willingness to keep looking, to never turn away, and to never imagine that we've ever arrived anywhere, right? Because this confrontation really with your own ego, it's this constant having to face your own mind, to have to face your own mind, and to recognize that the ego sense in the mind has this ability to keep hiding through its protections, keep strategizing, and it will use guilt and shame, and it will use projection and blame, and it will use fear. It will use all of these ways to keep itself alive. Now, we could say in the truest truth, there is no ego sense, there is no mind. It doesn't exist as a separate entity. But there's no point saying that and without acknowledging that there's a part of this journey where that does feel true, because the part of this journey, this unfolding, this undoing, this great undoing, that is the intensest, is the part where there has to be a facing the ego again and again and again, and remaining in the truth, remaining in the truth, and catching all the subtleties of the ego sense that wants to protect and identify and keep itself alive. It wants to believe in its own rightness, okay? This is the core root of separation, the core of the human condition. It wants to believe its own rightness. And so the confrontation with your own ego is having to meet the feelings that come up when that core protection of I'm right has to be faced. And it's not that it's letting go into no, you're wrong, but it's a letting go of its holding on to being right. Because being right has an opposite, and it's a protection, and it holds a barrier to goodness, to true righteousness. It holds a barrier to that goodness that you are in truth, where there are no opposites. And so really, this unraveling is in a way about facing again and again the need to be right, the ego's need to be right, because that's what separation is. It's this deep belief that I'm right, even if it's believing I'm right, that I'm unlovable or unworthy or I'm separate, however deep and subtle that is. The belief that I'm right is a belief that holds a quality of victimhood, and it believes there's an opposite, and it believes that I'm right and you're wrong. It's always holding this and it's holding this energy of shame and guilt within it, and it's projecting a blame to keep itself protected. And now, in truth, there's so much kindness for this, of course, but it has to see through itself, and life will create the circumstances when ready, when there's a maturity. You're never faced with yourself in a way that you're not ready to face yourself, right? No one else is creating that. Your consciousness is creating the face-off, right? The ego face-off within the internal dynamics. You're only ever brought into a facing what you're ready to face. And it doesn't mean that it's easy. It's not. It's hard. And it takes everything to remain and to not keep moving in that same process. And that's why we're speaking of this willingness to always be aware and this willingness to always look. And we could say, be willing to be wrong, because where there's an openness to let go of the need to be right, the willingness to be wrong gives way to a humbling where we discover what is before right and wrong. But we have to be willing to be wrong. The willingness to look is a willingness to be wrong. And then explore and find out. Don't find out that you were right after all. Find out what is before and come to a meeting, the resolution of the one heart. Come to the love where there's no question, the one love, the being, the freedom from the, right? And we will have to go through this again and again, because this is what is undoing the great imbalance. The great imbalance is the whole play of separation. It's a whole play of a deep, collective, narcissistic belief in a rightness, in a greatness. That is the whole imbalance, right? And we are invited within our internal functioning to meet our part of that, right? Our part of the great imbalance, which is meeting this inner place of holding on to, I'm right, through the willingness to say, what if I'm wrong? Because what if I'm wrong opens up a looking. And in the looking, it brings us to a presence of awareness that's willing to see our own holding patterns and protections, and to be humbled in the admission, there's protection there. All that is needed, we don't have to psychoanalyze it, not at all. It's all that is needed is this willingness to say, there's protection. There's some kind of defense there. Illuminate it and fall into the presence of being, right? Because as soon as we let go and we're humbled out of our protection, it doesn't matter. No one's then coming and saying, oh no, you were wrong, you're bad, you're bad. That's the shame that then will pull the attention back into the same strategy of being right, right? It's this constant pull of the ego sense to bring back its protection, bring back its holding, and this whole unfolding of what awakening truly is awakening out of that core belief, that conditioned belief that I'm right and that there's an opposite. And that within the inferior ego plays as I'm not lovable, I'm bad, I'm not enough, all of these ways, right? And the more that we can recognize the goodness, the essential goodness and innocence of the being, we have the light, we hold the light, we are the light of being that has the power, the force of love, of innocence, of integrity, of the integral whole. We are that. Within our being, we are that has the capacity to hold a presence of love for our own great misunderstanding, and to know that everything that happens in life that feels uncomfortable, stirring, and like a shake-up that brings resistance and a feeling of challenge, it's happening to shake up so we have the possibility of feeling those protective places inside us that we otherwise wouldn't have the grace of feeling. So when we are ready, the snow globe gets shaken, right? When we are ready, everything gets stirred up so that we can feel what the intelligence is saying. You're ready to feel this on a trajectory of freedom and refining out of the holding patterns of denser frequencies. You're ready to feel through that frequency, break orbit into a finer frequency of being, and rest more deeply in the love and the light of your true essence nature, and to feel more of a finer frequency of the wholeness of who you are, the love that you are. And as this breaking orbit happens, it's uncomfortable for true surrender to happen. It's uncomfortable to let go of protection and a need to be right. And it's uncomfortable to feel humbled. But you know, the grace is, it's an internal process. You don't ever have to speak of it. This is the beauty, because it doesn't actually matter within the story. Sometimes it will be spoken, and part of the humility is speaking it. But you will feel within your internal mechanics whether speaking it is something that is part of the trajectory of your unfolding. And if it is, it might be spoken and shared, and the part of the humbling might be an apology, but it might not be. It might just be that the knowing brings a sense of truth, and a natural speaking doesn't happen. There's no rules in this. It's about being humbled within your internal sense of what you are, out of your sense of being a person and the personal limitation, to the impersonal, unlimited, fine frequency of being. Because in this, you're one in love. And so the resolution is in the heart. The resolution is in love. And that's why sometimes, often, the work can happen inside, and then the surface of life changes, and nothing needs to be spoken or processed out on the surface, because the resolution in the heart morphs the whole picture on the surface of life. And the resolution in the heart, where you're resting in freedom, dissolves the whole narrative. It's gone. Doesn't matter. Love is just love. One is one, right? And this is what we are opening to, is the freedom of the one, the freedom of no more story, no more narrative, nothing to process, nothing to move through the mind, because we're not functioning within the mind's psychological capacity. We're now in a finer frequency where the communication is finer. It's through the frequency of love. It's through the frequency of a deep resolved knowing in the heart, where something's complete and they just don't need to play out on the surface anymore. So this is the magic of refinement, right? This is the magic of refinement that we're speaking of here. The subtleties, the power and the grace of refinement. The refinement happens once we are in the knowing of the being. When we are in the knowing of the being, we know the sanctuary, the stillness, the silence, and the incredible grace of the peace and the innocence. And we can feel the alive flow of the knowing of the being that's flowing within itself as an intelligence that is divinely whole, and an intelligence that flows as the appearance of creation for as long as it needs to. So, here now, it's all about the resonance of being and your sense of being the fine resonant frequency, knowing yourself in the being, as the being, and resting here in the stillness, in the silence, in the wholeness and innocence of true essence nature. And hear the openness, hear the balancing, hear the harmony, hear the flow of bliss that is nourishing itself, flowing within itself to nourish itself. A fine frequency of the divine, attunement with this fine frequency is what really the flow of bliss is, this fine frequency flowing within itself to nourish itself and in a way enliven and amplify the frequency. And that's why this resonance of being able to be so present with your own nervous system, whatever's happening in it, is to be able to recognize that all you know as awareness is this resonance. Nothing else is known. Everything else is an appearance or a thought. All that is really known is the resonance of your own consciousness knowing itself, whether it's meeting itself as discordance or whether it's knowing its own purity as the openness, and then the refinement of consciousness into itself, finer and finer frequencies, until the fineness of the frequency comes to the frequency of the one, a fine frequency of that which could be called Brahman or God, a fine frequency of the self knowing itself and no longer referencing itself, because its knowing of itself has come before the referencing its own existence. And the knowing is pure. What is? What is? Just this, just this, just this. So resting here in the finest possible frequency of being yourself.